Hare Krishna, dear devotees. Thank you very much for being with us once again in these weekly videos about the Gita for Everyone program. Today we're going to discuss chapter 14, the modes of material nature, the three modes of material nature. Here, this chapter, Krishna would explain technically how we can obtain freedom for this material nature. But first of all, let's revise what the analogy for this section, chapter 13 to 18, the third section of the Bhagavad Gita. We're in the prison house, although we know who we are, although we know what our duty is, we know where we come from, we know we want to connect with Krishna, but we are entrapped in this material nature. Remember chapter 13 called Material Nature, Enjoyed in Consciousness. In this chapter, Krishna will explain more in detail about material nature. Material nature, basically, he says, means the three modes. The topic is the prison. We are in the prison house. We are caught up in this material world, in this material body. So Krishna will explain to us three bars, which are like when you see a prison, and then you see there's always a bar. So these bars are the ones that we have to cut in order to be free from that. So the title of the chapter is the modes, or the three modes of material nature. So what does this mean? The way that we operate, the way that we function. And the way that we function in this material world is the way that we get caught up, we get trapped. So the topic, or in regards of the analogy, is the three bars that we want to break. So the chapter begins when Krishna is explaining that again, he says, again I will declare this knowledge. And the reasoning behind this, as we can see in the sequence of the conversation that is taking place now, is that Krishna is emphasizing the glories of devotional service. He's trying to convince Arjuna. And he said, other sages who have followed this path have achieved perfection. So Krishna is persuading Arjuna, if you follow this path, you'll be able to be free. So this is how the chapter begins. It has only 27 verses, not too long a chapter, and it ends with Krishna explaining, after all the details that he will give us in chapter 14, he says the best way to cut these three bars is by engaging in bhakti yoga na sevate. If you can engage in devotional service, automatically these modes will be destroyed, will be cut. The topic is the bars. How to identify these bars. And in fact, I said that this chapter is quite technical because not only he categorizes the three modes, he explains the benefit of one of them, goodness, the one that it's easier to break. And in fact, although Krishna in chapter 2, he recommends that we have to rise above all the three modes. In text 45 in chapter 2, I believe Krishna explains Traguna Visaya Veda, that the Vedas deal with the three modes. But out of these three modes, in this chapter, he will explain that the best mode of those is the mode of goodness. Why? Because it's easier to cut. So this is the topic, the modes, the bars. How can we cut it? The different sections in this chapter are the explanation of these modes. What are the manifestations? What are the characteristics of the modes? What is the destination of somebody who dies in a particular mode? What is the result of each of these modes? So that's what I said, it's a very technical chapter. The connection with the previous chapter. This is important because, in fact, chapter 13, 14, 15, 16, and all the way up to 18 are connected through the analysis of the modes. In chapter 13, there's a couple, 2 or 3 mentions, brief mentions of the modes. But in chapter 14, the modes take center stage. Now, in all these subsequent chapters, Krishna will refer often to what happens to someone who acts in those particular modes. So that is the connection. Chapter 14 elaborates on material nature. Remember when he says nature, enjoying consciousness? Nature refers to material nature, and material nature means the three modes. So that is the connection. And that explanation is not only going to be limited to chapter 14, but as I said, in the following chapters, Krishna will bring again, up to chapter 18, will bring again this point of the modes. The connection with the next chapter is that chapter 15 is the yoga of the Supreme Person. Basically, yoga means to connect. In other words, we are in the prison house, and where are we going? It's not enough to just get out of the prison. But once we get out of the prison house, we achieve Brahman, or we achieve the spiritual platform, then what do? We don't just stand outside of the prison house. So that's why the connection with the Supreme in chapter 15 it will be explained. In fact, in chapter 15, we gave the analogy that it's like the map, it's the plan, the escape plan, and that it's the Vedas. So Krishna here talks about renunciation of these modes, detachment from these modes. And in chapter 15, it will explain how to do that, the know-how. That's what Krishna will present in chapter 15. Now, one thing in this chapter, there's no analogies. Krishna is just presenting the whole concept of the modes in 27 verses. But we find one question by Arjuna in text number 21. In this is a very interesting question. Although Krishna is on a roll, he's explaining all these things, very technical details. Arjuna asks, again, a similar question that he has asked before. In chapter 2, text 54, he asks, how can I recognize someone who is transcending, someone who's in the spiritual path? So here, the same thing, after Krishna presents the concept of the modes, he says, what is his behavior? What are the symptoms? And how does that person transcend the modes? So from text 22 to 25, Krishna explains. And it is very interesting. Why? Because in chapter 2, Krishna gives some descriptions of the transcendentalist. Then in chapter 5, again, he gives more descriptions about someone who works in devotion, a transcendental, a yogi, etc. And in chapter 9 and in chapter 10, in chapter 12, again, he keeps describing the devotee. But here, he gives a very specific description of someone who's actually breaking the bars, breaking the modes. That person is described in text 2 to 25. But the final question, because Arjuna presents actually 3 questions here, the final question is how to cut these modes, how to break through, how to become detached from these modes, or transcend these modes. That answer is given in text 26. If you perform devotional service, then these modes will be transcended. That's what Krishna explains. And I am the basis of that place, that once you transcend, or once you are free, I am the basis of that. That's called the Brahma Bhuta, or the spiritual platform. So, no analogies, one question with 3 sections or 3 points that Arjuna presents. Some very specific answers by Lord Krishna. And the idea of this chapter, the personal aspect that this chapter has in your spiritual advancement, is that you can easily assess in which mode I am, what is my default mode, how do I operate. In this way, we can know in which way we can occupy ourselves in devotional service. How can we be careful about the influence of tamaguna, or the mode of ignorance, or rajaguna, the mode of passion. Now, as I said, Krishna has a certain style. He had mentioned the modes in different chapters previously. Chapter 2, in chapter 3, he refers to the mode of passion as the cause for the person being caught up in lusty desires, etc. But in this particular chapter, he explains that all these modes, without exception, can be cut if we engage firmly in devotional service. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope this is useful for your study, for your remembering the Bhagavad Gita, and also for presenting it in a very simple way to others. Thank you. Hare Krishna, Glory to Srila Prabhupada.